Okay, recording's in progress. There we go. All right, so I'm going to open up with the first thing. Marla, if you can skip to their bio section, please. Next slide. Before we begin, I want to obviously make sure that I thank the co-panelists. I'm kind of moderating panelists, playing dual roles here. First person I'm going to introduce is Yodi Habaler. I knew I was going to do that. Halamariam, excuse me, who is the Associate General Counsel at Facebook, and then Dave Carns, who is our Chief Revenue Officer at Casepoint. Cody, can you just take a few seconds and talk about you?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and it's no problem on the name. It happens a lot. So hi everyone, I'm Yodi. You can just call me Yodi, that works. I am an Associate General Counsel at Facebook, working in the e-discovery and information governance space. I have spent the vast majority of my career in that space. Prior to joining Facebook in 2019, I spent many years at various law firms in the Washington, D.C. and also Tokyo, Japan area. Originally from Dallas, but have been a transplant in D.C. for many years, and so sort of consider myself a Washingtonian now, and really happy to be joining all of you here today. Thank you.
Perfect. Dave?
Great, everyone. My name is David Carns, and I am based out of the DC area. Looking onto the National Beltway right now, so that's always exciting. I'm a recovering attorney. I also have the distinction, I suppose, of creating the Advanced Litigation Technology program at Georgetown University for the School of Continuing Studies. I led practice technology and information technology at 2 different AmLaw 100 firms, so I'm kind of steeped in the legal technology tradition. I've been at Casepoint for, gosh, 10 years now, a little over, now as the Chief Revenue Officer. And you know, Casepoint is a legal discovery software company that specializes in information governance, discovery, compliance, internal investigations, and we support corporations, law firms, and government agencies.
Perfect. And I will round out the trio here. I am, as already mentioned, Sonia Judkins. I'm the Senior Manager of Discovery and Information Governance at T-Mobile. And we joined T-Mobile last year as a result of a merger with Sprint. And prior to that, I was at Nextels for about 20-something years at the company, doing much of the same things as my panelists here of working on processes, information governance, discovery requests. Also dabble in records retention and working with IT, making sure that the systems and the processes so that I could understand them as a result of our wonderful discovery requests. So not an attorney, but I like to partner with them every day, all day, so that I can learn and grow, and that's why we're here. So we're going to get to the next slide, Marla, please, if you will. Kind of takes me to why are we here? I appreciate that everyone is here, but I wanted to kind of talk about information governance in general. And part of Yodi and David, when we were talking, we were like, well, what is it? And before we get into that, it's funny because as I was looking up, I Googled it. I think I did a simple search like IG, and to my surprise, information governance was not the first topic. It was TikTok, which says, I guess, which I didn't know. I should have asked my teenager. And then, you know, it stands for obviously Instagram or Inspector General. There's other conversations which IG stands for. But for today's conference or this session, we're definitely talking about information governance. I don't want to confuse anyone and make sure that they understand the topic of what we're talking about here. So throughout this hour-long conversation, we're going to ask that you guys participate voluntarily if you can. There are going to be 2 questions, and we're going to poll the answers throughout the presentation. The first one is going to be coming up, and what we're going to do is we want to hear the feedback. We have an idea of what information governance is, what it means. I think as you will hear through the panelists that it means different things for different industries potentially and different roles. So Marla, can you take us to the next slide? And surprise, this is going to be one of our first questions. It's a poll time. So I'm going to give you guys just a minute, and I know you don't typically start webinars with answering questions and asking what you think, but we really want to get a sense of what do people think IG means. These are some definitions that I pulled together that really kind of describe IG, and we want to give you about 30 seconds to quickly just look at it, take your gut feeling on what you think IG means and how it's defined. You should be able to click on the polls. And Marla, can you double check that that's working for our colleagues here?
Do you see the poll up?
No. And of course we practice this, but of course real time it never happens. Oh, there we go. There it is. Everyone should be able to see that poll. Thank you for the chat saying you couldn't see it. You should be able to see it now. So we'll give everybody another minute just to take a look and see what you think IG really means or defined. One person, I'm going to say. Oh, we're getting a couple of responses. Good, good, good. Okay, I'm going to give it 20 more seconds. Countdown, make it interesting.
Like watching a horse race.
I know, like, like I wanted to be this one, I wanted to be that one. Okay, we're gonna end it. So looks like most people, well, obviously everyone picked an option, whether 1 through 4.
We've had someone who said it could be all of the above also.
Oh, very good. I'm not sure who said that, but guess what? You're right. It's all the definitions. Some I picked from Wikipedia, some I picked from ARMA, some of the definitions I made up. However, definitely IG is all of those things. And that's what we're kind of going to talk about just generally and how it relates to your practical life, what it really means. How can you apply that terminology, the processes, what it's made of? And that's what we want to kind of discuss. So Marla, next slide for me, please. Great. As we are talking, so I want to make sure IG has an important role. You wouldn't be here, as I'm sure, as a person who's listening to the Masters Conference if you've never heard the term, you don't understand what it means. Yodi, I want to start with you and ask you kind of, obviously you have a lot of experience in creating solutions and processes and looking at things. If you were teaching a class about IG, what are some of the things that you would want people to know about it? What would you describe, and what information would you provide to them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sonia. And I think the previous slide, the poll was a really fun, a little bit of a trick question, but a fun jumping off point for this conversation and for that question, because I think it really illustrates how varied the theme really is across information governance. And I think it has a lot to do with where we are in our sort of maturity as a discipline, the things that we're all seeing in our various areas or spheres of influence. And so I think, to answer that question, I think it's a little bit of a lot of things, right? I think information governance, if I look at it as a practice area, as a subject area, or as a discipline, I think it's really a lot of different facets that come together that speak to or underpin information. Information specifically in sort of large tranches or large volumes, and within an organizational context. So we're looking at all the other sort of very robust disciplines that have also been stood up in the last 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years, including, but not limited to the items that you have listed here. So I think if I was to stand up an information governance course, and I have been actually in talks with a few educational law schools for something to this effect, I think it would be sort of a survey course of, let's think about all the ways in which information can be implicated in an organizational or corporate structure, and the different laws and regulations and ideas and schools of thought that really speak to how we are doing that currently in the corporate space. And so that includes, I think, I wouldn't say primarily, but very importantly, privacy. That's a big driver of what's happening right now in the regulatory sort of landscape with information. Security as well. Obviously, e-discovery. I think it's interesting to me that information governance really was birthed, in my opinion, really out of the e-discovery workflow and perspective, and it has since sort of taken on a life of its own, which I think is right and sort of proper and on trend. But I think there are still significant e-discovery touch points that would be relevant and super important to an information governance sort of education. Data governance, compliance, risk, cyber, IT, all of these things I think play a key role in that overarching governance of information, that proactive governance of information. So, I mean, I would probably set out a course that has sort of a survey. Here are all the different ways in which information sort of comes up, and the different facets or disciplines that have sort of stood up over the past 20 plus years to address some of that. And then from there, go into a bit more of a deeper dive into the governance and the processes, the policies, the structures, the architectures, all the things that really get to the nitty gritty of information governance, but to try to set that foundation at that higher, more holistic level.
Great, and it's ironic that you say that, because that's the picture that's on the slide is exactly why I picked the picture. It was because each of those things could be its own entity, but they kind of relate when it comes to information governance and relating them and the effect of them, the cause and effect of making sure that the information is transparent and it's flowing. So thank you for that. David,
Sure.
I know that you have a variety of clients and that you work with. Are there any commonalities that you have with those clients who practice IG? Do you see different industries doing different things? Do you see different clients? How do you just see? Can you describe what you see with your clients?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. I feel like across all industries, they're facing similar information governance challenges. I mean, look, especially as business process automation and digital transformation, across all walks of life really takes hold. Every organization is creating a lot of information. And, there's this constant balancing act of the value of that information versus its cost. Now, something I commonly see is that many organizations are disciplined about performing software security assessments and determining who's the application owner for this data and who's the data manager for this application. And that all seems to be taken pretty seriously from the information systems or information technology group. But it does feel to me, and maybe it's a limited scope, who knows, but what's less common is when organizations ask, what are the risks of adding this data to our information governance landscape? And how are we balancing those risks with the benefits? So what I mean by that, some of it can be very simple. If there is a common repository for important internal documents, and then there's a brand new, the SharePoint's being rolled out in a brand new way, do people realize there's now a bifurcation of what is the authoritative source within an organization for this data? That's a simple risk cost analysis, because that could just be confusion internally. But then I also wonder how often organizations, and what I've seen is sometimes limited, are they thinking about the downstream effects of the data that they're choosing to store? And that can be a cost that doesn't kind of hit people over the head immediately, but can be quite significant.
Well, I know it from a discovery perspective, it definitely hits. And that's, I think, thing people don't often think about, particularly at the beginning when you're planning to come up with these processes and plans. Like you say, if you're rolling out a new SharePoint site, well, what if the old one has a legal hold on it? Like, what are the costs for that? I don't even think they think about that, which I think is one of the reasons why e-discovery professionals, much like Yodi said, have been pushing that InfoGov perspectives throughout their organizations. So I totally agree. Yodi, one more question. So what advice would you give e-discovery professionals about IG? If you just had a bunch of wonderful, smart colleagues, what would you share with them? How would you explain IG to someone who's maybe new in the industry, who doesn't really understand all the connections? What would you tell them?
That's a good question. And it's specifically someone in e-discovery leaning professional and sort of, okay, yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that I think that e-discovery professionals are probably the best situated to pivot just a tiny bit into information governance. It's not a large leap, right? It's a discipline, e-discovery, that puts you right into the middle of managing workflows, dealing with gigantic amounts of information. And so I think the transition or the broadening of focus could be a very natural one. And I think it's a great opportunity now, and sort of where we find ourselves in industry. If someone was so inclined to really to benefit from sort of the opportunities that we see around us. So I would sort of encourage people who have any sort of bent or interest to pursue information governance to do so. I think it's a great time. We're seeing sort of great opportunities abound. I think in terms of making that transition or starting to look at information governance, there's a lot happening in the space. Masters Conference, there's a ton of conferences that speak to pieces of information governance, right? Going back to my comments earlier about what is InfoGov. Well, you can go jump into the privacy realm of things. There's a lot going on in the privacy world, certainly a lot in security, compliance. So I think that it's really about figuring out which of these sort of facets interest you, and what would be an area of focus that you would like to sort of cling on to and start from, in addition to e-discovery, because I think these pieces can kind of build on top of each other. And then in terms of applying information governance to the work that we do and sort of the influence that we can have, I think it's important to try to figure out what the mission could be, what the agenda really could be for information governance within your job, right? So let's say you're a case manager or an e-disco attorney, and you're working within like a robust e-discovery practice. Is there even an information governance world where you are that has been sort of stood up? And it may not be called information governance, it might be called something else, but is there a feeling that some people are starting to look at these proactive InfoGov-like questions? And if so, that might be a natural opportunity to plug in there. And if not, that's also a great situation, because then you can start to lead some of those efforts where you are. And then I think also thinking about, what does success look like for information governance, right? Are we looking long-term? Which, we should be, but are we also looking at the shorter term goals and milestones and wins that we can find along the way, and really calibrating the work that you're going to be doing within your organization's larger mission? Perfect.
Great. Yeah, I think my title was actually changed to include information governance, and I was just like, I don't want that. That's too big. Like, I'll just want my discovery title. And so I run into other people in the industry or in the field where they're like, oh, you're doing InfoGov now. I'm like, no, I don't. I mean, I always was, but I didn't want it to be on my business card. So it's definitely, it can be overwhelming sometimes and challenging, but because there's so many facets of it and so many layers of it. But I think at the core, most e-discovery professionals or paraprofessionals, that's what we do. We're just, because of the result of the discovery, you find yourself looking for information. You find yourself looking at data sources, and then it catapults you into having conversations with IT and security and all these other organizations that we've been talking about. So I definitely totally agree that it's bigger than most people give it credit. So next slide, we're going to move on because I'm going to try to keep us on time.
Really quickly, Sonia, we had somebody say that there's no shame in InfoGov.
I totally
love
agree.
that. We all need t-shirts. We need t-shirts that
hey.
say that. I love it. There is no
Smart
shame.
thing.
There's only pride and joy
Right?
and excitement in information governance. Absolutely.
Totally agree. So I also wanted to make sure that we touched on kind of the financial impact of InfoGov. And for example, I want to make sure that we touch on how do you get buy-in? Where do you get it from? Who do you need to partner with? Why is it important? So David, I want to, your title is Chief Revenue Officer. Like that means something. You're looking at money. So I want to make sure I ask you a question. What do you think is IG's impact as the Chief Revenue Officer of Casepoint? Does it play a role in when people bring you ideas or concept? Do you think about that? Do you apply processes? What does that look like in your world as an officer?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the thing is, and I think we've already touched on this, but a lot of times, depending on how an organization kind of evolved, sometimes information governance is thought to be a records management issue, or maybe it is about IT, or maybe a different organization sees it as all being about part of their compliance or their legal team, et cetera. But the thing is, the entire company is impacted by the information governance practices, and it has very real world effects on an organization. One of the areas that I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's specifically about just finding information within an organization. That can be a cost if you're unable to put your hands on the right information at the right time. And obviously, the cost of creating new data these days is very small. I don't know about other people's organizations, but I certainly have heard tales over the past 18 months where everyone's like, oh yeah, now we're using Teams like crazy, or we're using Google Chat. Slack has become our best friend, and everyone is creating a lot of information. It's cheap to create it, but what are the impacts of either A, not being able to find it, or B, what are the impacts of needing to deal with that information from a downstream perspective? Whether it is adhering to requirements to comply with the CCPA or GDPR and responding to a DSAR request, those sorts of things. There's a downstream impact of storing all this wonderful data. And I often within our organization need to pause and ask, like, do we need one more repository for very similar information that we're already storing in a different repository? Or additionally concerning can be things like an email system may very well have retention policies already applied to it. So you might feel like, well, good. That means we're getting a handle on not having it get too voluminous over time. And it feels good, except for, yeah, but is your ticketing system for internal customer support also feeding in that exact same email? And is that support ticketing system, does that have the same retention policies as your normal email systems? Do we even know how to extract some of this data as it's being stored? Some of these newer collaboration systems that are out there, it turns out getting the data out of the system isn't nearly as easy as it is creating it. So I'm constantly thinking about those sorts of concerns because there's a real long-term cost about interacting with data that's been so easily created, but not having a handle on it. I had one client that said, and who knows if this is accurate for their organization, but if it does come down to either compliance response, DSAR responses, or even things like data breach responses, et cetera, they calculated that for each document that leaves their organization to be reviewed by outside counsel could cost them $5 to $10 per document, ultimately, as an organization. And at the rate that we create documents around here, I'm pretty sure that's an awfully significant cost to the company. So yeah, there does, obviously there is the benefit of using information, but then there is a real cost of dealing with the information once it's been created.
Yeah, I totally get that. As someone who has drafted, created records retention policies and the schedules of the types of documents that exist, it has real cost implication if you don't do it. And I think that's the other thing, as we mentioned before, the connection of that data, that information. Just because it's in this system doesn't mean it's not duplicated in a downflow system. And why do we have, 6 repositories that capture somebody's last name? Like, to me, that's mind-boggling. But again, part of the task and the job that I have, as well as most of you have, is how do we share that information correctly so that it captures what it needs to capture for each person's use, but yet it still has the right life cycle. And that's really, really hard to manage and balance. And I think that's the challenge. That's the good part about IG and its processes and all of the things that it has. And I think if people can establish those habits of, okay, at the end of the day, like I personally, at the end of each week, I do a scrub. And if I have emails that say, thank you, period, those emails are gone. I don't need another email that says thank you. I mean, I like to send it because I want to be polite. But at the end of the week, I know, because I sit in discovery, I don't need that email. So I personally have made a small step to try to just manage my own data better and make sure that people are trying to do the same thing. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think it's at the very heart of what I would think is, or what I would consider the root of information governance, which is really that constant balancing of value and risk, and teetering and tottering, back and forth, because we're going to have both of those elements in any organizational space. And so it's constant, value, and it's smart to have the money guy here on this webinar to speak to, because that's really having to make that case. And your slide here, Sonia, says, how do you get buy-in, right? It's having to make that case effectively, persuasively, and then consistently over time. That information governance really addresses both, not just the risk, which is I think more sort of obvious, information, there's risks everywhere, but like keying into the value that information can bring, and managing, harnessing, governing information well can actually catapult an organization into sort of better in different spheres of functioning.
Yeah. So Dave, let me ask you one more question, because now it's just, I'm being nosy. So if I'm coming to you and you got the money, like you're holding the money bags, is there anything that you look for from people when they're approaching you that's like, oh, they really have that together? They're explaining it. They're explaining it in a way that you understand it, one, and that two, you're willing to commit financial resources behind it. Because as we've been talking about it, IG is really, really big. So does it matter to you, or do you analyze like, oh, that's just a piece of it? Do you do extra work to figure out where they are? Or do you just take whoever's coming in their presentation? Like, I'm just nosy because I want some more money, so I'm looking for tips.
I think at the core of all of this is when people come to talk about something that's going to impact how we handle information governance, there has to be a sense of there's real curiosity about what really is happening in the life cycle of the data that's being requested. A lot of times it seems to me that we all obviously see the first order effect. I need to store this data for this purpose. And then the sentence ends there, and so does the paragraph, and so does the document. It's oftentimes, well, this is the first order effect. But when people talk about the second, the third, or sometimes fourth order effect, then I feel like we're really getting into the meat of the matter, because when I worked in law firms in the mid 90s, I still worked at a firm where you literally went back to the file room and you grabbed a accordion file, and all of the correspondence, the entirety of it, was in one little thing in a reverse chronological order, with the two little tabs up on the top where you organize things. It wasn't much data for a very large case. It would not be that much data, but now there's so much of it. I really want to hear people that they're thinking about, they're curious about the second, third, fourth order effects of the request to create more data, how it's going to be managed, et cetera. And whether it happens to be about legal fees, or whether it just happens to be about IT costs of storing this data, or its compliance with regulations that mandates that we store certain kinds of data. The conversation can never end on the first order effects, because I think we all know that, from the Titanic, that that's just at the tip of the iceberg, and we really need to dig deeper than that.
That's great. Perfect. Okay, Marlon, next slide.
Well, before we do that, Sonia, we do have a comment.
Sure.
And it said Teams, Slack, Quip, OneNote, etc. Easy to create data, but difficult to search and produce. Volumes plus complexity of production. InfoGov should speak to the future proofing, quote, of data.
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, personally speaking, I think that there are so many platforms that have so much data as what we're talking about, that whatever platform we're using, I think at the core, the problem, and I call it a problem, and because I don't have my arms around it yet, is how do you manage it? How do you put caps on it? Can you put caps on it? Do you put, whether it's retention settings, purging, automatic this, automatic that? It's the maintenance of it. And then, as we've been talking about, what is the value? Is that really a poor business record? Do we need to keep that? Or is it just transient data that's just conversational? In my former life at my other company, creating a records policy was really hard work. That was probably the hardest. I'd rather take a request from an agency because it's really hard to figure out your whole organization, and everyone has their ideas, whether I was talking to the finance people who needed things for their other regulations, or I needed the salespeople who wanted to retain the new promotion. So all of those things matter, I think, particularly with those applications. And, clearly we're in the age of technology, that we're never going back to the Flintstone days. Things are never going to be, like David said, those flat files of just going in a file cabinet and picking something off a drawer. Although we still have those, you have to take that on top of all the electronic data that's stored in all these different applications, and really try to figure out how can we harness this so we pull out or extract. And they're not simple applications to extract. They're all different. They're all proprietary. How you use them. What I did learn recently is that some of this backend settings make it really easy to do certain things and make it really difficult to do other things. And that is just by trial and error. When I get a discovery request and I'm like, oh, Slack. I never used Slack before my new company. So it's been a complete learning curve. Or any other application. I think they're all useful, they have content, but then I think it's harder from an organizational perspective to try to figure out what is the value of what you were just talking about. And I start conversations, in Slack, and then I go to Teams, and then I go to messaging, and then I go on the phone, and then I go here and I go there. Well, if you're having a discovery request like I often do, it's hard to figure out where that thread is. And then, well, if they only pulling from this location, how do you know you got all the information? And am I the one that's going to say what value that is? I think it's just a hard nut to figure out, how do we crack that and how do we make it universal? Jody, what do you think? Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the commenter is right. There are so many tools and channels and systems in our sort of institutional corporate spaces nowadays. And I know when I was in private practice, prior to joining Facebook, I saw this with all of my clients too, taking on Slack, doing this, and really trying to figure out as a company what they want to do and how they want to let their employees do their job, essentially, and to allow technology in to help speed up and make things fun and fast and evolve with the trends, but also how are we going to do that in this space? How are we going to do that with our employees? And so I think the commenter is right in terms of InfoGov should have a seat at that table at the very ideally at the outset, to be able to inform, to provide information and guidance and recommendations as to, okay, if we do allow this system or this whatever, these are the ways in which we need to operationalize that, right? Here are the things that the requirements we would need to put that into place. We, probably need a policy or two to address it, right? There has to be some sort of packaging around the implementation of different tools and systems. I think that's squarely within the information governance mandate and something that we should be looking at within industry.
Yep, totally agree. Okay, Marla, next slide. We only got a couple to go, and I promise you guys we're gonna stay on task here. Surprise, it's a poll. I'm like, I told you there were two, so we're halfway through. We're gonna get through this. So Marla, if you could do your magic and put the poll up. The question is really, where does IG sit in your organization? Do you think it belongs in legal, privacy, IT, records, compliance, or something else? So we'll give everybody a quick second. Where does it sit currently? And then we're gonna dig a little deeper about where you think it may sit and why. Oh, yay, this is I'm so happy this is working. Uh-oh, somebody's saying something else. Must be getting good. All right, it says 30 seconds. I'm gonna give y'all 10 seconds. It's enough people. Okay, well, it looks like records is winning. So I'm curious to know why people think it's records, why they picked that. Definitely compliance, and 3 people said something else. So I definitely want to know where those other places that you think IG should sit. So what do you think, Dave, about kind of IG? If you had to create your own company and you wanted to promote IG practices, would you have an owner? Would you have a steering group? Would you just have one point person pulling the puppets like a puppeteer? Like, how would you organize it? Where would you put it?
Right. It's interesting. I think to my prior comment, I think what is the key is it needs to be somewhere where there is curiosity about how the data is being dealt with. This cannot be simply a checkbox on a form, or, are you thinking about IG? Yes, I am. Okay, great. Well, then that's done. It needs to, there's tendrils, and we have to follow all of the thought processes and how this data affects the organization. So I would argue that whether it's in compliance or IT or records or legal or anywhere else, something else, for me personally, it is not about there's a right owner and a wrong owner within an organization, but I think that owner does need to have the curiosity about how data is flowing through an organization. And I also think that it has to be a part of an organization that does have purview into these other effects. Now, if that organization department is IT, so be it. And they're really thinking through all of the effects of the data, great. If it happens to be legal in a particular company, then legal it is. But I don't think there's a right answer or a wrong answer. I know in many organizations, their IG group is born out of, because if they've been around for a long time, the records department. Well, that's great. Then I think that's where it needs to be, so long as there is interest and curiosity about what's really going on. And then I would also say that it probably, if I was doing it from scratch and as my own organization that I was creating, I would probably want it to be a collaborative effort as well, because the reality is it touches so many disciplines, and those second, third, fourth order effects are sometimes hard to spot, that I would want to hear from my colleagues about their concerns and about how this new data that we want to create might be impacting us in a risky way.
Yeah, Yodi, what do you think?
I agree with David's points. I like them. I think I like the curiosity point. I had not thought of sort of that word, but I think it's appropriate in that sort of a singular driving interest to understand the life cycle of information within the organization. So I concur with that, and I would also, my answers would have been, visibility. What org or group has that the right level of visibility into sort of those life cycle questions within information, and then buy-in, like what sort of group or org has the most influence to be able to persuade and inform the right decision makers within an organization. It's interesting. I've seen this in private practice. I saw a lot of like variations on these themes that sort of line up with the answers here. In that InfoGov kind of was all over. I mean, it was sometimes it was an actual group that was within a team. Sometimes there was a steering committee, like an information governance committee, where InfoGov was sort of added on as other duties as assigned, and so you had an IT person, a lawyer, come together once a month to talk shop about information governance. I do think we're probably beyond that model, and that InfoGov is certainly deserving and worthy of full-time attention. There's a lot to do in this space, and so I would sort of be a proponent of having information governance stand up as a discipline and have people who are focused almost wholly on these issues. But it's interesting to me to see this sort of array of answers, which interesting but not surprising, because I think it's probably very reflective of what's going on right now in the industry.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the other comments that I want to make sure that I mention is that I think, much to what Dave said, is that it's not static. It's not a one-time, yep, check. This is not something you just do once and then you just check it off and you keep on going. It's a constant living, breathing thing. And I think a good takeaway that I try to practice is go back and wherever it sits, whether it's legal, privacy, records, wherever, that it's constantly being evergreen and it's always being checked on. It's an active thing. It's not just, oh yeah, we have an IT policy. We all know that policy means nothing without the practice of the policy. So if you're not going after it, seeking, much to what you said, they were being active and questioning and curiosity, then it's just as good as the paper that it's written on, which is probably outdated. So definitely totally agree with that. All right, Marla, next slide. One backup one, and then we'll get on it. All right. Marla can go back. If not, I will just talk about it. So there we go. So partnership. We've talked a lot about kind of IG, and I think the theme that if no one's getting it is it's wide, it's vast, it's encompassing different levels, different groups, all those types of things. Yodi, I wanted to ask you kind of, why do you think it's good to engage in different partners, cross-partnering with other people in your organization? What's the benefit? What's the importance? What do you think you gain from it, particularly around IG and either standing it up or maintaining it?
Yeah, I think those cross-functional partnerships are so tremendously important in the information governance space because of all the reasons we've sort of described or discussed here. Information governance is sort of a shared responsibility. And I think, David, you pointed out earlier, it really impacts every piece of the business. And so starting from sort of that as the foundational tenet of information governance, we need to have strong partnerships around the business that are informed, that can come to the table with sort of their insights from their points of view, so that you can collaborate within, different teams and sub-teams to make important decisions. So in that, you have to have IT, you've got to have your compliance folks, you need records, you need legal, you need eDisco, and to have that sort of ongoing conversation, addressing needs as they arise, but also looking around the corner for, things coming down the pike. And really establishing a shared understanding, a shared language, right? A shared commonality in terms of how things are described, something as simple as just terms, how we're thinking, what do we mean when we say X or Y or Z? Having that and having that be a robust, centered, tranche of experience within those professionals, I think is key.
Yeah, I'll add on just quickly that one of the things that I have had experience with was we basically created like an acronym dictionary for the company, which was life-changing. When I'm talking to engineers, they are saying things that I'm like, just like I did for this research of IG, I'm like, wait, I didn't even think, and my 10-year-old was like, why are you looking up IG? That's Instagram. And I'm like, well, I didn't know that's not Instagram. I mean, it is, but that's not what I'm talking about. So she just was like, you're doing a panel on IG and Instagram. I'm like, no, dear. So I think that something like that, the terminology, the language, the understanding, particularly if a corporation or organization is storing information, like you're storing records, define what that means, come up with those terms. And, it doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but just list it so that people can look it up quickly, which has been tremendously helpful in the e-discovery world, because I don't know what some of those acronyms mean. And I think that's a really good thing that people can take away. If you don't have something like that, start it. I literally just started keeping a log of, certain codes and certain different things. I'm like, what is CCR? I'm like, what is that? So when you talk to those different business units who are using that language and they're using that terminology, they're not going to tell the legal team, oh, they're not going to explain it. They're just going to say, the CCR macro is the, I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I would encourage people to just have those conversations. If you don't have something on paper, have the conversation, meet with someone in another organization, learn how they're using their workflows, understand where that data is going, particularly if you sit in discovery or other areas, but that's really important, that those workflows and some of those wonderful engineers who are creating these wonderful diagrams, they're great, but there's nothing like a conversation to understand what really happens, where does it go? Those are things that I would definitely tell people to do. I strongly encourage people every quarter, as much as you can, find somebody else that's not in your organization and try to understand what they're doing in their organization, particularly around the IG. Where are they storing it? What you thought they were using, they might have built a new system, or much like Dave said, there's a new version. And so what you think is there may not be there. So I wanted to throw that out. What do you think, David? Do you think that culture plays a role, whether or not you're a mature company, you're a young company, young as in, 21 or younger? Do you think that matters? Do you think, I often laugh that my dad was like an old geezer and, this gray hair, but he had wisdom of stuff, and me trying to tell him what to do wasn't going to work. I think it also applies in business sometimes, where you have people who have been there for a long time, who know a lot of information. There is a lot of information that is not always recorded. Do you think that culture plays a role in that, or the effects of different people who've been there, short terms, long terms, and experiences?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. And the thing is, culture can kind of pop up in interesting little ways. So one little thought experiment that came to mind is, let's say there's a project management database that's core to a particular function of a company. And there's a description field where we're going to write all the notes about a description of this one project. There could be a culture around, oh, well, then I absolutely need to store all that information in the description field. That is a requirement of this application. But there also could be a culture of someone saying, like, there's just not enough room in that thing. I mean, that one field doesn't have enough room. So what I'm going to do this instead, and I think everyone in my group is going to really appreciate this. I'm going to use, let's say an organization uses Google Docs. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a Google Doc gives me a lot more room, a lot more space to enter in all my details. And I'll just I'll copy and paste the URL to that Google Doc in the description field. And that should solve the problem for me, because now I have a lot more space to, put in all of the things about the project that we're working on, and I'm not constrained. Well, that culture of being creative and inventive and solving problems on the fly, while very, you could applaud that in many realms, can cause a significant downstream effect in an information governance way. Because now all of a sudden, the data extraction cost of trying to follow all those URLs and make sure you have rights to those documents and pull that information down is going to cause a pretty big downstream effect. So culture shows up in interesting ways. Sometimes the creativity and let's problem solve on the fly and just make a decision and go for it can kind of come around and bite you. And trying to just have the awareness of these downstream effects can make a big difference.
Yeah, Yodi, what about any tools? Have you worked with any particular tools that specialize in IG that you use either to manage or as metrics and say, okay, let's take a look at that? And have you had any experience looking at that, or is that even something that's not on the roadmap? Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, certainly tons of experience with tools and sort of architecture. I won't speak to any specifically by name, but there are a ton. There are a ton out there. It's a very vibrant market at the moment. And so I think the advice I would have there is to, and I think this ties into David's point, understand sort of the culture, but the ways in which people like to operate in their day-to-day jobs. What are the pain points people are experiencing? What are the needs? What frustrates people? What makes people happy? To try to get that level of insight and intelligence on the community that's going to be using these tools, and then go to these conversations when you're looking to onboard or to build internally, really informed with that, because that level of detail can really help make or break, for lack of a better phrase, make or break whether a tool is adopted successfully or not, or whether it just becomes yet another thing we have to manage and govern and deal with. I've had great success with a variety of tools. I had some misses with others, but I think regardless of what tool people use, I think it's really trying to customize the tool in a way that's easy, that's impactful almost on day one, doesn't take a long time to adopt and to get buy-in. And ultimately, it's just going to be a value add to the organization as opposed to a pain point and or a distraction.
Yeah, I totally agree. I stood up a software a few years ago, and luckily I had the gumption to ask, like, do people even want this? Just because it was easy for me and it would make my life easier. I was one of 50 people that was going to use it. And I'm like, well, it makes no sense if it's only my data. I already know this. So I do think that those are very valuable points, and people are just like, and if you ask for it, then usually people feel included and more likely to participate. And then I'm a database person as well. So having data is important. That information is important. But if people are putting much to what you were talking about, David, of just putting in junky information or know too much information, then it defeats the purpose. I really think the planning out what the purpose is, why are we using it, how are we going to use it, and then go back to it and check on, is this working? I think that's the part that really I would encourage people to go back. It's one thing to build it, and it's one thing to use it. It's another thing to maintain it and check, is this still serving its purpose? Because things die out, things age out. So that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I had mentioned, just from a technology, regardless of what platform you're using, just make sure it's still working and using and useful, because if not, then you may need to revisit. There might be something bigger and better out there.
I agree. Yeah. Especially with the speed at which we're sort of developing information governance and the changes, that maturity and changes we're seeing happen all around us. I think that's right.
Right. And as companies grow and change, the needs might grow and change. The type of information that we used to keep 20 years ago is not the same type of information. So just encourage people to look at that, go back and touch that yearly, annually, however you can, whenever you can fit it in your daily jobs, because it's a task, but it's worth it, well worth it. All right, Marla, last couple of things, and I promise I'm watching the time.
Well, we have another question for you.
Perfect.
They would like to know if you have any recommended resources to learn more, for instance, organizations, books, podcasts, etc.
Oh, goodness. Yodi, why don't you take that first if you have anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. There used to be really good programming on information governance. There used to be a Chief Information Governance Officer, otherwise known as CIGO Summit, that my old firm used to host, I think in Chicago every year. That was really good. There is also an Information Governance Institute or institution. It's a think tank, also by my old firm. And that's sort of thought of as it was called the IGI. I just went to my team and I, a few of us went to the ARMA conference a few weeks ago. Maybe it was even last week. And that was surprisingly good. It was called ARMA InfoCon, my first time going. And I was really impressed with the programming, with the level of sort of thought. The discussions that were happening seemed really on point for what sort of I'm seeing in the landscape across industry for information governance. So I think those are good places to start. Privacy-wise, IAPP is a big one. That's a global privacy organization. You can also get certified in different regions, become like a certified information privacy professional, I think. And then there's a whole host of like security and compliance conferences, trainings, trade groups, et cetera, that you can find pretty easily, I think, online.
Yeah, I'll add that I'm a member of ACEDS and they have wonderful training material. There's material all out there. Don't do a Google search like I did because you'll just come up with Instagram. But there is, if you dig deep, and we are happy to look for resources and partner with you guys on those types of things. But there's a lot out there. I think, again, going back to what something Yodi said that's actually just stuck with me is be specific about which part of this, because there's a lot of it. So just kind of see if you can concentrate in one area or another if you can. All right, next slide, takeaways. I think we already kind of touched on it. Clearly, one of the things I wanted to make sure that was a useful thing to say, which is kind of analyze, plan, engage. There's a lot of action that has to be done. Clearly, most of us are in a reactive state. Something happens and then we figure out, oh, we got to go figure this out. But try to get to kind of a proactive state where it's engaging, it's active, it's learning, it's continuously learning about what your company has, how it's being stored, where is it going. All of those stakeholders are engaged. It's like family a little bit. You just kind of, some days are going to be good days and some days not so good, but to keep having that constant conversation about where is our information, what is it doing, what's its purpose, and what's its value, and keep continuing to make sure that all the people are there engaged. So I want to say thank you, Yodi. Thank you very much. I know we're at 5 seconds. We got to go. David, thank you very much for your opportunity. If there's any questions or anything from anyone, we definitely appreciate your participation, and thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.